When Miss Marple came to dinner, good evening, friends. Welcome to Stories with Jane. It is so very good to have you here. A particular welcome tonight to our listeners in Ontario, Canada. Do let us know where you are listening from. It brightens my evening more than I can say. Tonight's story is set around a dinner table, that most civilized of settings, and so often, as Miss Marple herself once observed, the place where people are least guarded. It made me think, have you ever sat at a dinner party and felt that something was not quite right? A strange silence, an exchanged glance, a toast that lasted a moment too long? Tell us in the comments. I find that sort of thing endlessly interesting. If you are new to this channel, do consider subscribing. It is simply the nicest way to stay connected and it costs nothing at all. Now, settle in and let us begin. There were 7 people at the dinner table the night Reginald Fortescue died, and not one of them would meet the other's eyes before the soup had grown cold. The invitation had seemed perfectly ordinary. A Friday evening in October, the old Pembridge House lit against the dark countryside, the smell of roasting pheasant drifting through corridors that had known 3 generations of secrets. The kind of evening that seemed, on paper, entirely unremarkable, and yet someone at that table had come prepared, not for dinner, for something that could not be undone. Miss Jane Marple had not been invited. She had come, as she sometimes did, because someone had asked her to, very quietly, the day before. By the time the last course was cleared, she would understand why. Chapter 1. An invitation of a particular kind. The letter had arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped beneath Miss Marple's door by hand, rather than delivered through the post, which was already unusual enough to warrant attention. It was written on cream notepaper, the kind one could only find in 1 or 2 shops in the county now, and the handwriting was small, careful, and clearly that of someone who had taken pains to keep their hand steady. It read, "Dear Miss Marple, I find I cannot speak of this to anyone I trust, because those I trust are the very people I am uncertain about. I wonder if you might be free to come to Pembridge House on Friday evening. There is to be a dinner. I have arranged a place for you, telling the others you are an old acquaintance of my mother's. Please come. I am frightened, though I cannot tell you precisely of what. Yours, Winifred Halliwell." Miss Marple read the letter twice, set it on the table beside her morning tea, and looked out the window at the October garden. The dahlias were going over. She thought about that for a moment, about things that looked perfectly fine and were, in fact, already finished. Then she reread the letter a 3rd time, folded it neatly, and placed it in her cardigan pocket. Frightened, though she could not say precisely of what. That was, in Miss Marple's experience, the most reliable kind of fear. Vague dread was almost always more accurate than specific alarm. It was the body knowing something the mind had not yet named. Pembridge House sat 3 miles from the village of Ashcroft Hollow, at the end of a lane that had not been properly maintained since before the war. The house itself was mid-Victorian, too large for its current occupants, with the particular exhausted grandeur of a property that had been modest in living expenses for about 15 years without quite falling apart. The gardens had been reduced. The staff had been reduced. The drawing room, when Miss Marple arrived on the Friday evening in Winifred Halliwell's small car, smelled of old flowers and new wood smoke, and something underneath both of those things that she could not immediately identify. Winifred herself was 31, pale, with dark circles that had been skillfully powdered over, and a smile that came and went like a cloud crossing. The sun. She was the niece of the house. Her mother's sister had married into the Fortescue family, which meant she occupied that most uncomfortable of social positions, connected by blood but not by inheritance, present by habit but not by right. She introduced Miss Marple around the drawing room with the easy grace of a woman who had been performing composure since childhood. There was Reginald Fortescue himself, the owner of the house, a broad, ruddy man of 62 who shook hands with rather more force than the occasion required, the way men do when they want to establish something. He had gray hair brushed back from a wide forehead and the kind of loud good cheer that sits above something it does not wish to examine. His wife, Lavinia, stood near the fireplace. She was a handsome woman, thin in the way of people who have stopped finding pleasure in eating, wearing a dress of dark green wool that Miss Marple suspected had not been bought recently. She greeted Miss Marple with the careful politeness of someone who has been told to be polite and is doing it correctly. Then there was Dr. Aubrey Quantock, who had been the family physician for 20 years, a slight man in his mid-50s with very clean hands and the specific social ease of a professional who has sat at many tables that were not quite his own. He spoke warmly and listened with an attentiveness that Miss Marple noted. Beside him sat his wife Harriet, a cheerful, broad-faced woman who collected china dogs and spoke of them rather more than the room required. The sixth guest was Edmund Stourton, a cousin of Reginald's from the Devon branch of the family, an architect reportedly, though he had not built anything of note in several years. He was thin, elegantly dressed in a dated way, and watched the room with the careful eyes of someone calculating distances. And then there was Oliver Bellingham, the solicitor. He arrived last, apologized without apparent sincerity for his lateness, and placed himself with professional smoothness at the edge of the social gathering, present but unattached to it. He knew everyone in the room, Miss Marple observed, but greeted each person with the precisely calibrated warmth of a man who keeps his relationships separate from one another. 7 at table, then, counting Miss Marple. She found her place card at the far end from the host. Winifred's doing, she suspected, a position from which one could observe the whole table without appearing to do so. Dinner was served at 7:30. The conversation moved through the usual channels. The weather, the state of the roads, a planning dispute in the village, someone's view on a recent decision by the county council. The pheasant was good, the claret was better. Miss Marple ate her soup and listened, and said very little, and watched Reginald Fortescue refill his glass 3 times before the fish course arrived. She also watched, just once, the way Oliver Bellingham looked at Lavinia Fortescue when Reginald was speaking to Edmund at the other end of the table. Not for long, a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, but it was the look of a man checking on something he has been worrying about. Not admiration, not desire, but the focused, private concern of someone who knows something no one else at the table knows. And she noted how Winifred, across from her, ate almost nothing, and laughed at all the right moments, and kept her hands in her lap when they were not required for a fork, perfectly still. The stillness of someone holding themselves together very deliberately. By the time the pudding arrived, Miss Marple had counted 4 silences that fell at odd moments, sudden gaps in conversation where 2 people at different ends of the table went quiet at the same instant, as though the same word had been spoken in both their heads. She found all of this very instructive. It was not until the gentlemen had rejoined the ladies in the drawing-room, and the evening had arrived at that comfortable middle passage of brandy and talk, that Reginald Fortescue set down his glass, pressed one hand briefly to his chest with an expression of mild puzzlement, and said, "I find I'm not quite," and fell. The speed with which Dr. Quantock reached Reginald's side was, in itself, notable. Not quite the reflex of a man who happened to be present and had medical training. More, the movement of someone already oriented toward the possibility. He knelt, checked the pulse, looked up at the room. His face was composed. "Someone telephone for an ambulance," he said. "And everyone please sit down." Miss Marple sat. She also watched. Lavinia Fortescue had not moved from her chair by the fire. She was looking at her husband on the floor, and her expression was not the expression of a woman watching her husband collapse. It was something older than that, and more complicated, a face that had already, somewhere in its private history, passed through the version of this moment that had fear and grief in it, and arrived at something that was neither. Edmund Stourton had gone very white. He was standing near the drinks tray, and he did not put down his glass, which meant that when his hand began to tremble slightly, the brandy shook. Oliver Bellingham had moved to Lavinia's side. Not kneeling, he was not that kind of man, but standing near her, a presence, while his eyes followed Dr. Quantock's examination with a particular, focused attention. Harriet Quantock had her hand over her mouth, and was looking at the wall rather than at the floor. And Winifred was at Miss Marple's elbow, almost immediately, her voice very low. "You see," she said, "nothing else, just, you see." The ambulance came. Reginald Fortescue was alive, if barely, his pulse weak, his breathing labored, his color not good at all. Dr. Quantock accompanied him. The others were left in the drawing-room with the remnants of an evening that had been going on in their separate internal lives well before this visible conclusion. A constable arrived at 10:30, a young man named Perkins, very serious, who took everyone's name and asked the same questions 4 times in slightly different ways. He did not ask Miss Marple very much, which she attributed to her appearance, and did not mind at all. It was while Constable Perkins was speaking to Edmund Stourton, who had recovered his composure and was answering in the measured tones of a professional man dealing with a bureaucratic inconvenience, that Miss Marple quietly collected the brandy glass that had been standing nearest Reginald Fortescue's place at the drinks tray. She wrapped it in her handkerchief. No one saw her do this, or, if they did, they took her for an elderly lady tidying up, which was more or less what she looked like. She put it in her handbag. The question that occupied Miss Marple through the long, cold drive back to the village. Winifred insisted on driving her, refused to discuss anything until they were out of sight of the house. Was not the most obvious one, not who, and not quite why. Yet, it was a more particular question, and it had to do with the timing. Reginald had refilled his glass 3 times during dinner. The bottle on the drinks tray was a different bottle. She had noticed automatically, in the way she noticed things that did not immediately announce their significance. A different decanter, or rather, she corrected herself, the same decanter refilled. But refilled when and by whom? "Tell me about Mr. Bellingham," Miss Marple said when they were on the main road. Winifred's hands tightened on the wheel. "Oliver has been the family solicitor for 11 years. He knew Uncle Reginald before that, through some business thing. He and Aunt Lavinia." She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "They've known each other a long time. I don't know anything more than that. I don't want to know more than that, because if I know more, then I have to decide something, and I don't." She stopped again. "I don't know what happened tonight," she said, "but I know it wasn't nothing." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It was certainly not nothing." She looked out the window at the October dark and thought about a woman in Tattleton, years ago, old Mrs. Pruitt's cook, who had known something was wrong the night her employer's nephew came to visit, and had said so to 3 people, and been ignored, and been right. The name would not come to her now, but the face did, the same quality of frightened certainty that would not quite form itself into words. Winifred had that quality. She had had it, Miss Marple suspected, for some time before this evening. Reginald Fortescue survived the night. That was the news by morning. Survived, but was ill. Seriously, in the manner of a man whose heart and system had been subjected to a considerable shock. The hospital would say no more than that, and Dr. Quantock, who had been there, had come home at 3 in the morning and was apparently sleeping. Chapter 2. The Solicitor's Afternoon. Oliver Bellingham had an office in Ashcroft Hollow above the chemist's. 3 rooms of quiet efficiency with a receptionist named Mrs. Doris Cyril, who wore sensible shoes, and guarded the inner office with the instinctive protectiveness of a woman who has done this work for 20 years. Miss Marple arrived on Saturday morning and asked to see Mr. Bellingham. Mrs. Cyril looked at her with the practiced assessment of a professional who has learned to categorize visitors. Client, creditor, nuisance, time-waster, with a single glance. She evidently placed Miss Marple in a category that required a moment's hesitation, then said she would see if he was available. He was. Oliver Bellingham was a man who occupied space carefully. Not a large office, but arranged so that you sat across a desk from him, with the sun at his back and slightly in your eyes, which Miss Marple suspected was not accidental. He was 60, very well dressed in the way of men who have made the suit do the work that natural authority might otherwise have to, and he greeted her with the smooth, formal warmth of a man who had decided in the 3 minutes he'd had to prepare that she was not a threat. That decision, Miss Marple reflected, was his first mistake. "I understand you were present last evening," she said pleasantly. "It must have been a great shock. Indeed it was." He folded his hands on the desk. "Poor Reginald. We must hope for the best." "Quite. He is, I understand, a man in reasonable health otherwise? For his age? I believe so. Dr. Quantock would know better than I." "Of course." A pause. "I wondered, forgive me, this may seem a peculiar question, whether Mr. Fortescue had been under any particular strain recently. Financial, perhaps, or professional." Something moved behind Bellingham's eyes, very briefly, the look of a man doing a rapid calculation. "I'm his solicitor, Miss Marple. Anything pertaining to my client's affairs?" Yes, of course." "I didn't mean to pry," she smiled vaguely. "I only ask because Winifred, Miss Halliwell, has been worried about him. She mentioned it to me recently, when we last met. Something about the estate. I may have misunderstood her." Another calculation. Miss Marple had deliberately been imprecise about her prior knowledge of Winifred. Enough to establish they were acquainted without revealing what Winifred had or hadn't told her. "The estate is in good order," he said, which was not the same thing as saying there was no strain. "I'm very glad to hear it," said Miss Marple warmly. She rose. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Bellingham. Such a trying business." "One hopes it will all be resolved very simply." She was at the door when he said, "What is it that you do, Miss Marple, if you don't mind my asking?" Winifred didn't say. "Oh, I'm retired," she said. "I keep a garden, mostly, and I observe things." She smiled again. "One has a great deal of time for observation when one reaches my age." He was still watching her, she knew, as she left. She could feel the specific quality of that attention. Not worried, quite, not yet. Measuring, which told her that there was something to measure against. From Bellingham's office, she walked along the high street and into the chemist's, and asked, while purchasing a bottle of cold remedy she did not need, whether the police had been in yet today. The young man behind the counter, eager and uninstructed in discretion, said yes. Actually, 2 detectives had been in to ask about something Reginald Fortescue had ordered recently. Prescription. Couldn't say what, naturally. Shame about the old gentleman, isn't it? So the police were already asking questions. Good. That simplified matters in one respect, and complicated them in another. She found Winifred that afternoon at the house, helping Lavinia receive 2 neighbors who had come to inquire after Reginald. The kind of neighborly call that is half kindness and half information gathering. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the drawing room, refused the offer of tea, and listened to Lavinia Fortescue talk about her husband's collapse. The performance was accomplished. Concern, appropriate distress, gratitude for the kindness of the visit. Not one false note that an ordinary observer would catch. But Miss Marple was not an ordinary observer, and she noticed that Lavinia spoke of her husband in the slightly elevated tones people use for the recently dead, not for someone expected to recover. After the neighbors left, Lavinia was briefly alone in the hallway for 30 seconds, waiting for Winifred to return with coats. She did not know Miss Marple could see her from the drawing-room doorway. She stood very still, and then she lifted both hands and pressed her palms flat against the sides of her own face, a gesture of such private exhaustion that it belonged to a room entirely alone. Miss Marple stepped quietly back. There were, she thought, a great many kinds of unhappiness, and not all of them were simple. Dr. Quantock received her at 4 o'clock on Sunday, in a sitting room that smelled of antiseptic and old books, and the specific cold of a radiator that has only recently been turned on. Harriet was not at home. She had gone, the doctor said, to visit her sister in Wymondham. He said this without particular inflection, and offered tea, and Miss Marple accepted it. And they sat across from each other in the way of two people who are deciding how much they know about one another. "How is Mr. Fortescue?" she asked. "Stable." He said it with the careful neutrality of a physician. Whether that stability continues will depend on a number of factors. "What do the hospital physicians say?" He was quiet for a moment. "They are running tests," he said at last. "The presentation is unusual, not what one would expect from a cardiac episode alone." "I see," said Miss Marple. She did see. "Dr. Quantock, you've been the Fortescue family physician for 20 years. You know this family quite well, I imagine."
"One comes to know families," he said, non-committally.
"Yes." She set down her cup. "I wonder if I could ask you something rather directly, and you could tell me whether you prefer not to answer it." He looked at her steadily. He had, she thought, been deciding since she arrived whether she was an elderly woman making social calls or something else. She watched him decide. "You may ask," he said. "Reginald Fortescue, had he made a new will recently or altered an existing one?" A pause. "I'm not his solicitor." "No, but you've been his physician. And men talk sometimes in the context of their health. They think about their affairs." She paused. "Has he been ill before this? Something that might have prompted him to review his arrangements?" Quantock got up and went to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to her. When he turned, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who has been carrying something at some distance and has decided to put it down. "He consulted me in July," he said. "He'd had dizzy spells, fatigue. He was worried it was his heart. I ran some tests. The heart was fine." A pause. "He mentioned, in passing, that he had recently instructed Bellingham to draw up a new will. He didn't tell me the details. He seemed relieved, as though it had resolved something. And then the dizzy spells stopped?" Quantock looked at her sharply. "How did you know that?" "I didn't," she said simply. "I wondered." He sat back down. "They stopped in August. He seemed quite well after that. I had no particular concerns." He looked at his hands. "I have them now." Miss Marple thought about what it must be like to be a conscientious doctor who has spent 20 years treating a family, and to sit in one's own sitting room and begin to understand what may have been happening under one's nose. It was not a comfortable thought. "The tests," she said, "at the hospital. Is a Contatine in the panel they're running?" He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he said very quietly, "I have asked them to check, yes." "Good," said Miss Marple. "That was the right thing to do."
She did not tell him about the brandy glass.
"Not yet."
But she took note of the fact that he had already asked. A man who had made a discreet,
professional inquiry to the hospital without waiting to be asked by the police. That was, she thought, significant in its own way. It could mean he was covering himself, or it could mean he was trying to do the right thing from the position of a man who had already waited one day. Too long. She found herself on the walk back through the lane, thinking about the July consultation, the new will, the dizzy spells that had then, conveniently, resolved, a man reassured about his health, a man who had just put his affairs in order, and someone at the dinner table who had decided not to wait any longer. The evenings were coming in fast now. By the time she reached the village, the sky had gone a dense, still gray that was not quite dark and not quite light, the kind of sky that made distances uncertain. She went home, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at her kitchen table, and thought about Oliver Bellingham's face when she had mentioned the estate, and Lavinia Fortescue's hands pressed flat against her face in the hallway, and Winifred's letter, "I am frightened, though I cannot tell you precisely of what." Chapter 3. A slow Tuesday. On Tuesday, nothing happened that advanced the matter at all. Miss Marple walked to the post office. She posted 2 letters. She bought a tin of shortbread that was on offer. She passed Constable Perkins in the street and said good morning. And he said good morning, and neither of them mentioned Pembridge House. She stopped at the library and found a recent novel she had been meaning to read, and borrowed it, and sat for a while at the table inside while Mrs. Turnbull catalogued some new arrivals. The library was very warm and smelled of heating oil and old paper. 2 children came in with their grandmother and spent a long time at the picture books. Miss Marple watched them and thought, as she sometimes did, about the particular quality of children's attention. The way they looked at a thing with their whole face, nothing held back. She had been very much that way once. She was not entirely sure she had lost it. She had a letter from her nephew Raymond, which was cheerful and full of news from London, and asked nothing of her that she couldn't deflect. In the afternoon she did some deadheading in the garden, the last of the season. The dahlias came out with a resignation that she found almost moving. They gave up being dahlias very quietly, without fuss. She thought about October, and about endings, and about how often something visible on a particular date had in fact been settled weeks before, in a decision taken in private that no one would know about until later. Winifred telephoned at 4:30 to say that Reginald's condition was unchanged, stable, but not improving. She also said, with a hesitancy that told Miss Marple something, "Edmund Stourton has been at the house a great deal this week. He and Aunt Lavinia. Talking. I don't know what about." "That's interesting," said Miss Marple. "Is it? I thought it might be, but I couldn't say why." "It's interesting because it tells us something about the new will," said Miss Marple. "Or, more precisely, about who knew about it." A silence. "Then, Edmund is in the will?" "I don't know," said Miss Marple honestly. "But he appears to have a reason to monitor the current situation very closely. That suggests he has something at stake in the outcome." A pause. "Has he been to the hospital?" "Not that I know of." Which was another kind of information. If Edmund had something at stake financially, one might expect him to want Reginald to survive, or not. His absence from the hospital and his presence at Lavinia's side told a particular kind of story. Whether it was the true story was another matter. Miss Marple spent the evening reading her novel, which was good, and thinking, at intervals, about people who had known that something was wrong, and had not been able to find the words for it in time. She thought about Winifred's letter. "I am frightened, though I cannot tell you precisely of what." There was something very sad about that kind of certainty, knowing the shape of a thing without being able to name it. Like smelling smoke and searching the house and finding nothing burning and going to bed and the thing finding you anyway. She went to bed at 10. Slept well. The brandy glass was in her bag, still wrapped in her handkerchief, which some people would have found disturbing, and which Miss Marple found merely practical. Tomorrow she intended to speak to Edmund Stourton. Edmund Stourton was staying at the Rose and Anchor in the village, which was the kind of inn that had been there since the 18th century, and maintained itself through a combination of stubbornness and the tourist trade. He had taken a room on the first floor. He was, Winifred had said, not a man with a great deal of work to return to. Miss Marple found him in the small lounge of the inn on Wednesday morning, with a copy of the Times he was not reading and a pot of coffee he had finished some time ago. He stood when she approached, which was the correct thing to do, and offered her a seat with the manner of a man who has had good manners since childhood, but whose good manners have not recently had much occasion for exercise. "I wondered if I might speak with you briefly," she said, "about last Friday evening." "I've already spoken to the detective inspector," he said. "Fellow came yesterday." "Yes, I'm sure. This is rather different. I'm an old friend of Winifred's. She is in a great deal of distress." He looked at her. He was assessing her as Bellingham had been assessing her, but differently. Bellingham had been calculating. Edmund Stourton was guarded. Yes, but in the manner of someone protecting a position rather than concealing a crime. There was a difference, and Miss Marple had learned to feel it. "She worries a great deal," he said, "about the family. More than they deserve, frankly. You and Mr. Fortescue are not close, I understand." "We were never close. Reginald has always been." He stopped, began again more carefully. "We have different ways of seeing things. You came to the dinner, though. Lavinia invited me. Lavinia and I have always got on well. She's had a difficult time. I come when she asks." Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. He said it plainly, without the careful calculation of a man managing information. The fondness for Lavinia seemed genuine. The difficulty of the marriage. She was hearing this from more than one direction now. "Mr. Stourton," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm not asking in order to make trouble for anyone. I'm asking because I think Winifred needs someone to know the truth of things." She paused. "Did you know that Mr. Fortescue had made a new will in August?" He went still, not alarmed, more the stillness of someone deciding how much he already knows that is safe. "To confirm, I heard something to that effect. From Lavinia?" "From Lavinia." A pause. She was unsettled by it. She didn't know the details, only that it had been done. "I see." Miss Marple looked at the cold coffee pot. "And you came to the dinner last Friday because she asked you. Was that usual, for him to have you both at the same table?" Something shifted in his face, a small compression around the mouth. "No, it wasn't usual at all. Reginald didn't enjoy my company. I assumed it meant something." "What did you assume it meant?" He looked at the window. "That he wanted witnesses," he said at last. "For something, I don't know what. Perhaps nothing. I may have been wrong." He had not been wrong, Miss Marple thought. But the something he had been witnessing was not what he had anticipated. He had expected, perhaps, an announcement, a confrontation, a formal occasion with its own particular choreography. He had not expected what actually happened. "Was there any point in the evening," she asked, "when you left the drawing room or the dining room? During dinner or before?" He frowned. "I stepped out for a moment before dinner. I went to the cloakroom off the main hall." "Why? And the drinks tray? The brandy decanter? Do you remember who was near it during the evening?" His frown deepened. "I can't say He stopped, looked at her, and something changed in his expression, the frown becoming something sharper and more serious. "You think it was in the drink?" he said. Not a heart thing at all." Miss Marple said nothing. "Oh," said Edmund Stourton quietly, and then he sat for a moment in that particular silence of a man who has just understood that he was in the same room as something that was already happening and had not known it. "The cloakroom," said Miss Marple gently. "How long were you gone?" 5 minutes, perhaps 7. I don't know." Long enough. Though not by him, she thought. His reaction was too immediate, too unguarded. The shock in his face was real. She thanked him and left him with his cold coffee and his recalibrated understanding of Friday evening. He had come to witness something, he had said. He had witnessed something, just not what he'd expected. Outside, the October air was sharp and clear. Miss Marple walked back along the high street and thought about the drinks tray, and about 5 minutes, and about who else had been near it. Chapter 4. The Glass. The detective inspector from the county constabulary came to see Miss Marple on Wednesday afternoon. His name was Coldacre, a solid, careful man in his 40s who wore his rank lightly and had the interviewing style of someone who expects to be underestimated and plans accordingly. They sat in Miss Marple's sitting room, and he accepted a biscuit, and they spoke for 40 minutes. He had, she gathered, already spoken to everyone who had been at the dinner. He had the hospital results. He was not saying what they indicated, but the way he did not say it indicated quite a lot. The tests Dr. Quantock had quietly requested had presumably been run. He asked her what she had observed. She told him, carefully and selectively. Not everything, because she had not yet decided what everything meant, and she did not think Coldacre had either. She told him about the brandy being refilled. She told him about the 4 silences at the dinner table. She told him about Edmund Stourton's 5-minute absence before dinner. He listened with the still attentiveness of a man who is genuinely gathering rather than confirming. Then she opened her handbag and placed Reginald Fortescue's brandy glass, still wrapped in her handkerchief, on the table. Coldacre looked at it, then at her. "Where did you get this?" "From the drinks tray. Friday evening while Constable Perkins was speaking to Mr. Stourton. I felt it was better preserved than left." A pause, Miss Marple. His voice was level. "That is evidence." "Yes," she agreed. "I believe it is. That is why I kept it." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she could see him deciding something. Then he picked up the glass with a kind of resigned professionalism and said, "Tell me exactly what you observed about the drinks tray." She did. All of it. This time. The original decanter on the table when guests arrived. The replacement decanter. The same one, she thought, though she could not be certain. Appearing before the gentlemen rejoined the ladies. The particular poured glass that had been sitting near Reginald's usual spot at the tray before the gathering in the drawing-room. She had not seen him pour it. It had been there, Coldacre wrote. When he finished, he looked up. "You said the glass was nearest his usual spot at the tray." "How did you know his usual spot?" "He had stood there twice already," she said, "during the drinks before dinner. He had a particular way of standing, left hand in his pocket, right holding the glass. That meant he always stood with his right side to the wall, which was the right end of the tray. It was a habit." She paused. "People tend to use the same square foot of floor in a room they know well, particularly men of his age and temperament. They establish a territory." Coldacre made another note. Then he said, without looking up, "You're quite sure about the decanter? That it was replaced?" "I'm sure the one on the tray at 8 o'clock was not the one that had been there at 7. The original had a slight crack in the stopper. A very small chip, really, on the right side. The replacement did not." Coldacre looked up at that. "I notice such things," said Miss Marple, rather apologetically. After he left, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the room and thought about what she had not told him. Not yet. About Oliver Bellingham and Lavinia. About the new will and what it might contain. About the July dizzy spells, which had resolved so conveniently when the new will was done. She had not told him because she was not yet certain, not quite. And because a wrong word at this stage would allow 1 or 2 people in the story to move. She needed them still. She also thought about the particular difficulty of disliking someone's circumstances without disliking them. Lavinia Fortescue had been, by all accounts, in a marriage that had not been kind. She had pressed her palms flat against her face in a hallway, where she thought no one could see her. There was something honest in that gesture that Miss Marple had not stopped thinking about. Honesty and guilt were not, unfortunately, mutually exclusive. She had seen that before in St. Mary Mead, though she would rather not have. A woman called Ada Plowright years ago, who had been entirely honest about everything except the one matter that had cost someone their life. The honesty had made it worse in a way. There was less to hold on to. Oliver Bellingham came to find her, which was in its way an answer. Thursday morning, at 10 o'clock, without appointment, at her front door. He had dressed carefully, more carefully than the occasion of a morning call required, and his composure was present but of the deliberate kind, maintained rather than natural. She showed him into the sitting-room and offered tea, which he declined, and they sat across from each other in the bright, cold October morning light. "I understand you've been speaking to people," he said, not hostile, measured. "I've been speaking to several of the dinner guests. Yes, as I mentioned when we met on Saturday, Winifred has been worried." Winifred. She said it with something that was not quite affection and not quite dismissal. The tone of a man who considers someone a peripheral figure and is only now reconsidering the calculation. "She wrote to me," said Miss Marple, "before the dinner. She was frightened. She didn't know of what, precisely, which is not unusual when the thing one is frightened of is still in the future." She paused. "You were at Pembridge House several times this past year. I am the family solicitor."
"Yes, and a friend of Mrs. Fortescue's. She let that sit."
He looked at her directly then. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she said pleasantly. "I'm observing. There's a difference." Another pause. "Mr. Bellingham, the new will. I imagine the police have asked you about it." "I know, Doctor. Quantock has spoken to them. I know about the tests." He was very still. "I want to ask you," said Miss Marple, "not about its contents, because I know you can't tell me, but about one specific matter. When Mr. Fortescue came to you in August to make a new will, who knew he was doing it?" A long pause. "I cannot. I am not asking for the details of the will itself. Only, who knew? Were you discreet? Or did he tell people? Did he tell his wife?"
Bellingham looked at his hands. Something in him was deciding. She had seen this before. The moment when a person who has been managing a
situation reaches the edge of what they are able to manage alone. "He told her," Bellingham said at last. "He told Lavinia. That was deliberate. He wanted her to know it had changed." "Changed from what?" A pause. "The previous will left her, the house, the investments, the entirety of the estate. The new will divides the estate, quite significantly. The house goes to a charity he'd been involved with. Lavinia receives a life income, modest by the standard she's accustomed to. The bulk goes to Edmund Staunton's children. Not Edmund, his children. Reginald apparently felt he had reasons relating to an old debt to Edmund's father. It was complicated." "When did he tell her?" "I believe August, shortly after the will was signed." Miss Marple thought about that. August. The dizzy spells had resolved in August. Quantock had said so. Reginald Fortescue had made his new will, told his wife about it, and then stopped having dizzy spells, because whoever had been causing the dizzy spells had paused upon hearing about the new will, perhaps to consider, perhaps to plan something more reliable, or because the news had simply stopped an escalation that had not yet been decided upon. "Mr. Bellingham," she said, and her voice was very gentle now, because she had arrived at the place she had been heading since Thursday. "You and Lavinia Fortescue. How long has that been a friendship of the particular kind?" His jaw tightened. Then, slowly, it released. 12 years, he said. The first entirely unguarded thing he'd said. "And the new will," she said, "which leaves her very little." "Would have left her very little," he said quietly, if he had died naturally." "Yes." She let the silence sit. He had understood. She could see precisely what she was and was not saying. "It wasn't us," he said. I want you to know that. Whatever you think, it wasn't either of us." "I haven't said what I think," Miss Marple observed, but she had, by this point, a fairly clear view of it. Chapter 5. What Harriet Knew. The thing about Harriet Quantock was that she collected china dogs, spoke of them rather too much, and had, according to most of the people who encountered her, nothing of particular interest to contribute to any conversation. Miss Marple had found over the years that such assessments were worth very little. She telephoned the Quantock house on Thursday afternoon and asked if Mrs. Quantock had returned from Wymondham. She had. Miss Marple asked if she might call, and Harriet said yes, with the unguarded warmth of a woman who was not often asked. The Quantock sitting room was full of dogs. They stood on every surface: ceramic, porcelain, Staffordshire, a few of uncertain origin. They watched Miss Marple sit down with the glassy attentiveness of very small, very still witnesses. Harriet made tea and brought it in herself, and sat down with the slightly too bright manner of a woman who was pretending that everything was quite normal and doing it with most of her available energy. "I imagine it's been a difficult week," Miss Marple said. "Oh, yes, poor Reginald. Aubrey has been very worried." She poured. "He's been at the hospital a great deal. He feels he should have seen it earlier. Whatever it is, he is a conscientious man." Very. A small pause. Her hands were steady, Miss Marple noted, but her teacup sat slightly too far from the edge of the table, where it had been set down carefully, not casually. "He's always been very devoted to the Fortescue family. 20 years. "Mrs. Quantock," said Miss Marple, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you will not find it impertinent. I ask because I think the truth matters here, and because I believe you know something that you have not said to the police." Harriet looked at her. Her face, which had been maintaining its brightness, went still. It was, Miss Marple thought, almost a relief, the way people sometimes look when the performance becomes too heavy to hold. "I was at the dinner," Miss Marple continued. "I watched the table, I watched the drinks tray, and I watched the people near it." A long pause. The china dogs watched. "I saw Aubrey near the drinks tray," Harriet said, very quietly. "Before dinner he said he needed something from his coat, and he went out to the hallway where the coats were kept. But I was in the hallway. I'd gone out for a moment. The drawing room was warm, and he didn't go to the coats. He went to the drinks tray. He was at it for a few seconds. He thought I was in the drawing room." She stopped. "And you said nothing," said Miss Marple. "Not accusatory, simply." "He's my husband," said Harriet. Then, quickly, "He didn't. I don't believe he. Aubrey is not. He wouldn't." She stopped. She was doing the terrible calculus that wives and husbands do in such moments, the arithmetic of known character against observed fact, and finding the columns will not balance.
"I don't believe he would either," said Miss Marple, which was true.
She did not believe it. But she needed to understand what Quantock had been doing at the drinks tray, because there was a difference between a man who had been adding something to a decanter and a man who had been removing something from it. "Harriet," she said gently, "was it the brandy decanter specifically, or the tray in general?" Harriet blinked. "I, the decanter." He picked it up and put it down. Then he came and found me in the hallway and said, "Wasn't it warm in there?" And we went back in, picked it up and put it down, not refilled it. Set it down in a particular place, perhaps, or removed something from it, or checked it, or replaced it with one that had not been tampered with. Miss Marple sat very quietly for a moment. She thought about Dr. Quantock asking the hospital to run the toxicology test before the police had asked him. She thought about a conscientious physician of 20 years who had noticed something at the drinks tray before dinner, had noticed the decanter had been changed perhaps, and had quietly replaced it with the original, and then had spent the rest of the evening watching Reginald Fortescue drink. brandy from the safe decanter and thinking he had managed it. And then Reginald had collapsed anyway. 2 decanters. 2 attempts. Quantock had interrupted the first and not known there was a second method. Something already administered, perhaps, earlier in the day. Or in the soup. Or in the sherry before he arrived. She set down her teacup. "Mrs. Quantock," she said, "your husband did something trying to help Mr. Fortescue. I believe that. I believe he has not told the police because he isn't sure what he saw and doesn't want to make an accusation he can't support." She paused. "He needs to tell them today." Harriet looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded. Once. The kind of nod that means an entire internal argument has just concluded. Reginald Fortescue was moved out of the intensive care ward on Friday morning, 10 days after the dinner. Not well, but no longer in immediate danger. The hospital spoke of a slow recovery. The phrase they used was longer-term effects, which covered a range of possibilities none of them could currently define. Detective Inspector Coldacre came to see Miss Marple again on Friday afternoon. He had, in the 48 hours since Dr. Quantock had made his statement, done a great deal. The toxicology results had confirmed aconitine. In the sherry glass that had been recovered from the drawing room, not in the brandy at all. The decanter that Quantock had seen swapped before dinner had been, as he suspected, a clean one substituted for a doctored one. The person who had prepared it had apparently not known Quantock had noticed, or had been too committed to the secondary method to care. The sherry glass. Reginald had taken a single glass of sherry before dinner, poured by Winifred and offered around to the guests. The sherry had been fine, but Reginald's glass had had something added to it after it was poured. A small amount, insufficient to kill directly, but enough to begin the accumulation. And the glass had been recovered from the window ledge in the drawing room, where he'd set it when he'd gone in to dinner. The forensic detail was not Miss Marple's area. The understanding of why was. Coldacre had also, she gathered, obtained the contents of the new will through the proper channels. Edmund's children, the life income, the charity. He had read it with the careful attention of a detective and the slight bewilderment of someone who has not previously understood how the destruction of an expected inheritance can be the making of a motive. "The question," said Coldacre, "is who? We have 2 mechanisms, the brandy decanter, which was swapped before dinner by a person unknown, and then intercepted by Quantock, and the sherry glass, which was tampered with in the drawing room. The brandy mechanism required access to the house before the dinner. The sherry mechanism required being in the drawing room before Fortescue took his glass." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mrs. Fortescue was in the drawing room the entire time before dinner," she said. "She received guests there. She was the last one in it before the drawing room door was opened to guests. She had access to both the sherry and Mr. Fortescue's habitual movements. She also had the clearest motive," Coldacre said. "The new will leaves her with an income but not the estate. The old will would have made her a wealthy woman. If Fortescue dies before the new will can be enacted," he paused, "the old will stands. The brandy decanter," said Miss Marple. "Who would have had access to the house before the dinner guests arrived? Mrs. Fortescue, obviously. Winifred Hallowell, who was staying there. Edmund Stourton was there for lunch, according to Lavinia's diary. And Bellingham came in the afternoon, saw Lavinia alone, apparently, for about an hour. He looked at his notes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Nell Jarvis, let them all in and out." Miss Marple thought about Oliver Bellingham. 12 years of friendship, the new will, his insistence that it had not been either of them. "Inspector," she said, "do you know whether Mr. Fortescue had a habit with his brandy? Whether he always poured from the same side of the tray?" Coldacre looked at her. "We asked Mrs. Jarvis that, actually. She said yes. He always stood at the right end of the tray." "Old habit," It irritated her because he'd reached past the better brandy to get to his usual bottle. The one that had been on the right, the one that had been replaced with a clean one by Quantock, who had seen someone earlier that afternoon make the switch. The replacement had been put on the left, which meant the person who had replaced the original with the doctored one had put it on the right, because they knew his habit. Someone who knew Reginald Fortescue's very specific, very habitual movements. "Who was in the drawing room most often?" Miss Marple asked. "According to Mrs. Jarvis." Coldacre consulted his notes, then he went still. "Mrs. Fortescue," he said, "and Mr. Bellingham, every visit." A long pause. "They knew," said Miss Marple, "both of them. The old will, the new will, the habit at the brandy tray, the dinner arrangements. All of it." She did not need to say the rest. Coldacre was not a slow man. He arrested Lavinia Fortescue that evening at Pembridge House. Oliver Bellingham was arrested the following morning at his office in Ashcroft Hollow, where Mrs. Doris Cyril told the detective constable, with some asperity, that Mr. Bellingham had an appointment, and could they not simply make one themselves? The case would take several months to come to court. In the event, the prosecution established that the plan had begun in August, when the new will was signed, and Lavinia was told that the July dizzy spells had been a first attempt, abandoned when Reginald seemed suspicious and consulted Dr. Quantock, that the dinner had been Lavinia's invitation, Lavinia's arrangement of the guests, Lavinia's opportunity. Bellingham's role was harder to prove. He had not been in the drawing room in the 20 minutes before guests arrived. He had been in the house in the afternoon. Whether he had touched the brandy decanter would depend on Mrs. Jarvis, who had not quite seen clearly from where she was standing, and on the forensic evidence, which was partial. His barrister made much of this. It was not enough. He was convicted on the conspiracy, she on the attempt. Reginald Fortescue did not recover well. He was alive, which was more than it might have been. Chapter 6. What Winifred Said. Winifred came to see Miss Marple on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the arrests. She brought a tin of shortbread that she had made herself, which Miss Marple thought was a very considerate thing to do. They sat in the kitchen, because the sitting room seemed too formal for what was clearly going to be a conversation that required the kind of setting where people could look at the table rather than at each other. "I keep thinking," Winifred said after a while, "that I should have known. Not guessed, known. I was in that house. I saw them together, Aunt Lavinia and Oliver, for years. I saw what the marriage was. I saw—" She stopped. "I wrote to you because I was frightened, and I didn't know why. And when something terrible happened anyway, it felt like I'd failed to stop it." "You didn't fail," said Miss Marple. "You acted on what you felt. That is precisely the right thing. But I couldn't name it. It was just a feeling." "Feelings of that kind," said Miss Marple, "are rarely wrong about the fact of the danger. They are often wrong about the details, the method, the person. The feeling says something is wrong. It cannot always say what or how. But the feeling was right." She paused. "You were right to be frightened, and you were right to write." Winifred looked at her tea. "Do you think she was always going to do it? Or was it the will that?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully, because it deserved care. "I think," she said slowly, "that the marriage had been a very difficult one for a very long time. I think the friendship with Mr. Bellingham had been, for years, a way of surviving it. And I think the new will, the discovery that Reginald had decided to leave her relatively little after everything, I think that was the thing that crossed a line that might not otherwise have been crossed." She paused. "Which is not an excuse. It is simply an explanation. The two are not the same." Winifred was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel sorry for her?"
Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. Outside the kitchen window, the November garden was bare and honest. No dahlias now, no pretending.
Just the structure of things. I feel sorry, she said at last, for what her life was. For the years in which she had very few good options and took the ones that were available. I feel sorry for the marriage, and for whatever it cost her. She set down her cup. I do not feel sorry for the choice she made. Those are two different things, and I find I can hold them both at once without it being a contradiction. Winifred thought about this. I've been told that Reginald is improving a little, that he may be able to go home at some point, to a house that... She trailed off. The house would need to be sold, presumably, or sorted through. The charity would eventually take what it was owed. The estate was in the hands of solicitors, different solicitors now. Edmund Stourton's children, Miss Marple said. They will benefit, ultimately, from all of this, though I imagine they would prefer not to. His daughter came to the hospital, Winifred said. A girl of about 16. She sat with Reginald for an hour, apparently. She'd never met him. She just came. Miss Marple found she was glad to hear that. It was the kind of small human fact that did not resolve anything and was not meant to. It simply existed, a girl of 16, sitting with an old man she had not previously known, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and October, because someone had asked her to, or because she had decided to, and for no larger reason than that. Winifred, said Miss Marple, you should know that you did everything correctly. You noticed. You acted on what you noticed. The rest was not in your hands. Winifred looked at her for a moment. Then she said very quietly, Thank you. She stayed another hour. They finished the shortbread. It was very good. After she had gone, Miss Marple washed up the cups and stood at the kitchen window for a moment in the late November quiet. The garden, the bare structure of it, a blackbird on the fence, considering the ground with the absorbed professional attention of a creature who knows exactly what it is looking for. She watched it for a while. Then she dried her hands and went to write her reply to Raymond's letter, which she had been putting off for 2 weeks.